since before I was born, I think that the Sinaloa cartel or whatever the cartel was at the time always had their links into, a city like Chicago. When I was born, actually, my father was in prison. He was a drug trafficker, a big drug trafficker who worked with different organizations, and he was a big heroin dealer. And that was my introduction to the drug trade through my father. At an early age, he started teaching me and my brother, the business of drug trafficking. We ran our first load across the border at before we were 8 years old.
Obviously, El Chapo, um, as such an infamous name.
He wasn't easy to deal with, that's for sure. Our first dealings with him, just to make it clear, his organization kidnapped my brother.
Boom! Here we go. A boom with no video, just audio right now, because the guest, Margarito Flores, also known as J, short for Junior, is preferring not to show his face because he was a cooperator with the US government against Sinaloa Cartel, against El Chapo, against Arturo Beltran Leyva, against El Mayo. In fact, his evidence was using indictments against more than 50 drug traffickers. But he was also a drug trafficker himself at a major level. He confessed, along with his twin brother, Pedro Flores, also known as Pete, to trafficking more than 60 tons of cocaine, as well as heroin and crystal meth. If you're an American, if you're somewhere up on the East Coast, or in fact anywhere in the United States, and had a line of cocaine between about 1998 and 2008, there's a very good chance it went through the Flores Twins organization. But now he is looking for redemption. He's done some time in prison, 12 years, as well as cooperating. Came out and is looking to try and change things. Now, in this conversation, you can find Margarito around other places. A lot of you will be familiar with him from other places now. He's been more of a media presence. This conversation is more of a candid, casual talk. I got in touch with him and he was very generous with his time. What became a short conversation turned into a long conversation. And so this is that talk. What was it like in Chicago, growing up in Chicago, and that first links into trafficking and to linking up with the biggest players in Mexico?
Oh, for the most part, since before I was born, I think that the Sinaloa cartel or whatever the cartel was at the time always had their links into, a city like Chicago. I think as migrants and Mexicans started actually migrating into Chicago, for most people that don't know, I was like born into this, right? When I was born, actually, my father was in prison. He was a drug trafficker, a big drug trafficker who worked with different organizations, and he was a big heroin dealer who was arrested for 11 kilos of black tar heroin at the time, received a 10-year sentence, and after good time he came home when I was around 7.5, and that was my introduction to the drug trade through my father. At an early age, he started teaching me and my brother, the business of drug trafficking. We ran our first load across the border at before we were 8 years old.
Wow. Wow. So,
Mhm.
so, so when you went down with him to Mexico, and you were like, what? He was driving it in a car over the border, or how did he get over?
Oh, so yeah, we actually thought it was a vacation. We went to Mexico on our first trip out of Chicago. We were my father was in prison, and we had a hard life. Grew up very poor. My family was on government assistance at the time, so he came home and he was a provider at heart. He was used to having money, and he felt, I guess, it was like his obligation to provide money fast. So we took it was a small car, took the road to Mexico. It was it was a fun experience for my brother and I for sure. Went down to Mexico, and basically at that trip, he actually took us out to the mountains and basically introduced us to our first drug, which was going to be marijuana. And he took us through every step where we were, a part of the, cultivating of it, the harvesting, right? Picked out which plants he wanted. We had to let them sit and dry out and all that stuff, and compress the marijuana at that time into, was considered Mexican, right? Marijuana into, you know, it was 220 pounds, I believe.
And that
And
was
we
Sinaloa, or where was that in
No,
Mexico?
at that time we actually we went to the mountains in what was considered the Zacatecas, Durango, right? That area on this side of it. And my father at that time had, knew many people, and I guess that's where our education started. We He taught us how to, take down the gas tank, and we fished out the, the gas, I mean the drugs, right? The gas from the gas tank, and we're witness and helped them in every part of it. And that's what was going to be the next, that's what going to be our job for the next, 3 to 4 years, I think. And we took our first ride back up to the United States. When we actually got to the border, it was going to be our first time we were interrogated by federal officers. I tell everyone, my dad and my mom didn't bring our birth certificates on our first trip, and my father had 220 pounds of marijuana hidden in a gas tank with no birth certificates for my brother and I. So of course, Custom Border Patrol sent us to a second inspection, but we were twins. That me and my brother twins. We looked alike at that time. There was not a lot of twins. We were still like a big deal that we looked so much alike, and they took separated from our parents. And my father, I always recall this. It was the first time I actually like remember like not understanding something when he said, "Don't say nothing." Like I knew exactly what he meant, but he was worried that they were going to separate us, right?
And
And
they didn't think to search for the marijuana. They didn't think to search the gas.
no, but I remember seeing my father. It was like where they inspected the cars. It was like an office and it had glass. It was all glasses, and I could see my father pacing back and forth.
What was it like? I mean, did you consider, I mean, when you're like 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old doing that stuff, did you kind of think, I'm not like a regular kid here in school? My life's a bit of a kind of crazy movie? Or what, how did you process that as a kid,
Oh, wow.
having that experience compared to everyone else in your class who's like,
Yeah, you know what? That's a good question. Kind of explained this to the committee a little bit. I didn't have your regular childhood. I'm not saying I was the only one, but at that time, growing up in the States, even growing up in a place like Little Village, it's a working class neighborhood. We were different even early on because everyone had their mom and their dad. We still have that generation of Mexicans that don't believe in divorce. People went to work every day. Our dad being in prison was still rare. Like, so we were already kind of like mm, treated a little bit different because of that. But, I have older brothers and ignorance, right? What gang culture was like. All his friends, the whole neighborhood basically would hang out at our house when we were kids because there was no father to, say no. Or, my mom just would be like, okay, this is what friends do. And that's kind of started the trend of like our family being looked at a little bit different, right? To other families who come from Mexico, right? Settle down there, go to work every day. And here's his house, right? That's rare. There's no father, and there's a bunch of, teenagers that have a bunch of friends who are, gang members.
now
And
what kind of gang were they in, and what gang were they in, and you never got into the gang life yourself on that side of things?
you know what? My brothers were growing up. I mean, they were, which was considered probably the most violent, the most organized organization, which was the Lion Kings. And that's gonna play a big part on, my brother's drug trafficking time. And but we're talking about my, 7, 8 years old. So for sure I was already, you know, kind of living that part of the world where my brother was, a Lion King. My brother's 15 years older than me. You know, at that age, I still growing up, I'm basically being raised in that kind of culture, those environments. So by the time, my father comes around, him being in prison in the state, actually, he comes from, being around gang members. So he wasn't happy about it. He kicked my brothers out the house fast. It didn't take long. Like, what's going on? Like he despised gang members, believe it or not. Uh, it's just this weird
Yeah.
contradiction.
Yeah.
He despised them because he was in prison with them. He didn't understand, you know, their reasoning or why they would, have to, like what we consider in Chicago gangbang or whatever. But um, for instance, him coming home and kicking my older brothers out the house kind of pushed them away to having to provide for themselves now in a real manner, which led them to drug trafficking. And here I am, that separation between my older brothers and me and my twin brother is like he's giving us an education here, and they're learning the cocaine business on the streets.
Okay, just taking a quick break here. Just to say, if you like this podcast, if you like my work and you want to find more of it, then please go on to www.crashoutmedia.com. That's crashoutmedia.com. That's where you can see loads of my stories, my podcasts, interviews with active cartel members, interviewed with former cartel members, law enforcement, Dan Crenshaw in Congress in the anti-cartel task force, analysis, reportage, and everything about organized crime and drugs, trying to find truth, trying to find answers, trying to find better ways here. You can subscribe for free, or if you like it and want to support it and get access to everything, then just $5 a month gets you in there.
I think the gang culture, being around in that environment, taught my brother and I a lot. It was going to teach us how to succeed in that environment later. But we also never joined a gang. My older brother, that's something that he forbade us and made sure he didn't. By the time I was 12, 13 years old, and my dad went on the run again, left us with our older brother. He was already, kingpin himself, in the cocaine business.
Now, how much school did you do? How,
I actually went to high school. I was actually, this is a good question. No one ever asked me that, but I was actually, for the most part, my brother and I actually did really well in school. Um, we ended up going to a public high school right in my neighborhood, and in my junior year, I was actually kicked out of school by law enforcement. Them understanding who we were, they felt like, I wasn't part of a gang at that time. No way involved in gangs, but that was the environment we were in. And my older brother was he was a shot caller. And them understanding that part of it, it's like they kind of didn't, you were trying to clean up the school and basically gave us an ultimatum, and we were kicked out of school. But then I actually ended up getting a diploma by an alternative of like high school, where you go, basically it's like a GED, but fast track, and get a high school diploma. My twin brother did actually attend college. He did a few semesters in college. But by then we were already, in our own world of drug trafficking. So
you became very big, very young in terms of numbers in trafficking.
yeah.
Did it just blow up? Like, did you start
Mhm.
kind of small? It just grew and grew and grew very fast, or did you see yourselves right away, like as kind of entrepreneurs in this, or how did things escalate so fast?
I guess with my background, right? With my father, being in Mexico, that's what people like. I feel like there's two sides of us. Growing up in Chicago, up around those gangs and that culture, and then growing up in Mexico, where my father made sure he introduced us to everyone and made sure we treated everyone with respect. And coming from a small town, which was like my second home, as you know, it's all about respect, how you treat people, mannerisms, what your last name was, and how we carried ourselves, I think came naturally through my father. And so, um, by the time we're 13 going on to 17, we basically become my older brother's helpers in the business. And he, by that time, is working with the Juarez cartel, the Sinaloa cartel. It was still one organization. And and just being around the business all day, being around his associates, I was able to understand the even the Sinaloa or the cartel slang back then, when people were wearing silk shirts with the gold chains and stuff like that, and being around them, and being around, both environments where my brother actually went from being the kingpin in the neighborhood to actually starting to distribute, especially to black gangs in Chicago. Uh, and I was able to actually be a part of that and everything I was learning at the time. So when my brother got indicted, I was just turning 17. It's like one of his sources of supply, which was going to be a important person later on in the Sinaloa cartel, um, sent for my brother and I, and offered us a load of drugs, which was at that time our first deal was gonna be our own deal was gonna be 30 kilos of cocaine, which is, at that time, for someone like, I was 17 and it being our first deal, like it didn't seem like a lot for us, but it was a lot, under the circumstances. We sold our first 30 kilos that day, you know, received 50 kilos the next day. And basically, by the time we were 18, we were already moving anywhere from 300 to 400 kilos a month. And I guess, that started off like a run, I guess, that, just seeing the business, as a business and seeing the other side of it. I think not being part of a gang, the way we were raised, I think that helped us a lot. And having those relationships, from early on, and being able to, be businessmen, I think is what kind of propelled us. By the time I was 19, 20, uh, we were pushing well over 1,000 kilos in a month in Chicago. And, I explained this, like, this is without me ever going to Mexico. Like, this is the drugs are already in Chicago. Being basically a wholesale distributor for the Sinaloa cartel, and at that time for the Gulf cartel. Me, I have no direct ties to them. I have a middleman, and I'm 18, 19 years old, 20 years old. I'm making $2-3 million a month.
Now, like, do you think you were kind of in the right place at the right time, or the fact you had such good connections, and it was when, I mean, how did you blow up so fast? Or just the nature of the drug game? What do you think, looking back on it now? What made you just become this big, this fast?
Just to make it clear, you know this with your background.
Mm.
This doesn't The drug trafficking is not easy. There's people fail at it every day. So I don't know if my brother and I knew what a successful drug trafficker was, other than what we would see in the news at that time, which was like the Lord of the Skies or Caro Quintero. The movie Scarface to us was also a great movie, but it never motivated us to die like him. I think, it's that story, right? And I feel like what made my brother and I successful, that somehow, some way, growing up, we never wanted to be like anyone else. We always said, this, like, we never changed who we were. We got into business, for economics reasons, and we never let anything, change that we were there for one reason. We were obviously, I feel like, intelligent enough not to get involved in certain situations, but also I think it goes back to how we were raised. The simple principles that people take for granted: respect, doing the right thing, going out your way for others. Sometimes, like, some of the stuff that sounds like I'll be talking about the Bible, but in the drug trade, it was always about what type of person you were. And that is what actually I felt like took us, from where we started and where we're gonna end up at. All those, simple things that people think that are not a necessity, right? I think also is our parents. We were young. They didn't take us as a threat. I didn't want to be taken as a threat. So that made, the people we were involved with and associates, it made them more comfortable. And then in return, kind of, we would build these friendships or these relationships with people. And, it was, I think for them, it's always like, I know these guys ain't gonna do me wrong. But in reality, it's not because I was fearful. It's just that wasn't who we were. And I think that actually helped us, and it helped us all along the way. It actually helped us solidify some of the, those relationships we had with the biggest jugglers in the world. that I didn't want to be them.
So when you did meet Chapo, you met Arturo Beltran Leyva.
Yes, Arturo Beltran. I mean, who I met probably, some of the biggest drug lords. I met Nacho Coronel,
Okay,
Alfredo, Alfredo Beltran Leyva, uh, Mayo Zambada,
but
Vicente.
okay,
Wow, I mean, big drug lords. I worked with Lobo Valencia, um, from the Millennium Cartel, Mencho. Uh,
okay,
so, in our time from like working with, in Chicago to our time in Mexico, like, we dealt with, Azul's sons, right? He's deceased now. Like, I mean, too many people to actually,
yeah,
name, that we had some type of association with, or understanding, from Los Queenies to Noel Salguero to, I mean, there's so many individuals that we were around or associated with or did business with,
obviously El Chapo, um, as such an infamous name, and obviously later on you testified. What did you think of him as a person? What was he like on a personal level to deal with?
Mm, he wasn't easy to deal with, that's for sure. If you take down, all the drug lords I actually had business relationship with, he was probably the most difficult one. Uh, which is, something that people don't really realize. Um, our first dealings with him, just to make it clear, his organization kidnapped my brother at that time, which was uh Chapo Cidro was still part of his organization. It was his, under his command, who, Chapo Cidro, who now is, head of his own organization. He's gonna actually, be a friend of mine later, but my brother was kidnapped by him, um, over a debt. And even when he had evidence that, we didn't owe the debt, he still made me pay him his money. And he was a lot harder to deal with that we would rather deal with other people like his underlings because they were more on the business side and we would just take care of the business, and kind of try to keep him on a need to know basis for but for sure he wasn't that easy to deal with. Um I also think it was because he did look at my brother and I as real like as businessmen, and he always knew that we were gonna try to push as much as we could, and to him he had a strong demeanor, so I guess we would just try to get away with as much as we could, as you could tell on the recorded call, right?
Yeah,
That wasn't new to him, us asking him. What bothered him, was people don't realize, is that in the drug business you don't do that. You don't receive a shipment of drugs and then try to get a better price once you have them.
yeah, yeah. So like the prices you deal with these, this is a bricks of cocaine. Uh,
Just to make it clear, tons, right? Tons of cocaine.
on tons of cocaine. Okay, you're
So we were
negotiating
deep.
by tons by this time. So what kind of
Mhm.
price? I mean, what price would you pay them, and what price would you sell it at? What was
Oh,
your profit margin on the?
yeah. So the business, I mean, consists of different deals, right? I mean, it's kind of complex, right? Because that's a book on its own.
Hmm.
For the most part, we enter into a partnership, right? That's what the cartel is, right? It's a group of people, right, working together, for one cause, which was, at that time was to make money. And basically, there was times like we would set our own price, which was going to be the fairest price, the cheapest price in whatever city we were actually receiving the drugs at. And people, just to make it clear, uh, we never took advantage. It was like, what's the price? And if we said the price is this, and I need them for this, then that's what it was. But rest assured that they were not gonna come back and say, "Did you just like, like I didn't have to. I wasn't sleep good at night to make sure that it was a fair business. That they were never gonna come back and say, "Hold on, are you taking advantage of what you're doing?" So they, for the most part, the organizations, the cartels respected our business acumen, how we view things, how we did things. So we basically set the price or we'll negotiate when it came to Mexico. And they always gave us a 10, 15% at cost, just to make sure that our organization, was making money and could keep up any of the losses.
So what would the numbers be? I mean, like, would you buy for say 12K and sell for 18K, or what would the kind of number
Yeah,
be?
yeah. Again, depending on what what the business was. If we were coming from Colombia, obviously it's different. But just say if it was if we were receiving a shipment of drugs in LA, and just say that was the price, it was 12,000. Then I would sell it in Chicago for 19.5, or in DC for 25. Depending on where we're going. Canada, we would sell them for 38,000, 40,000, whatever the case. Different price. We would and different regions have different prices, and we would base it off of that.
How I mean, the network for moving it around the United States. I mean, was this with it was trucks? I understand with trailer trucks. I mean, you create your own trucking companies, or you just get truck drivers to carry it, or how does that whole business work of moving it around the USA?
Yeah, so the means were there's a lot of means, right? But for the most part, um, as I try to point out, our organization being successful, and I was working with, the Sinaloa cartel at that time as a whole, right? Because you do have different people that have different methods, but for the most part, how big organizations work, um, they're going to work with something that's going to be continuous, something that's, they have different projects going at one time. But for us, we did use trains, we did use airplanes, we did use uh, uh, different, transportation means. But for the most part, it was tractor trailers, long haul, um, uh, semis. So that was our mean of transportation. And what we would do we would actually find independent contractors, independent drivers that had their own, that worked as independent contractors, and find legitimate loads and haul them across, the country.
So some of the other people you're dealing with in Mexico, though, I mean, the big names. So obviously, El Mayo. What do you think of El Mayo as an individual? He's kind of a mythical status now. But what's he
Well,
like on a personal level?
this is the tricky part. I'm talking about, how I felt with him, back at that present time. When I'm talking about something, when it comes back to my life, I always like to put myself in that, mindset state and feeling. You know, to me, he reminded me a lot of, even nicer probably than my father. He took a liking to my brother and I. We had a very good relationship. He was a fierce man, but he was also one of the, most, I think, fairest. Like he was, like it's hard to explain. Our he I do feel like he had genuine like love and respect for us, because he looked at us young, and he had enough people in his organization that he respected, that had nothing but good things to say about us. So early on, he welcomed us, and he was actually, when it came to prices, when it came to any type of business, he was the one that would be like, whatever you guys decide, and you know what, here's an extra, something for for you guys. So yes, it doesn't surprise me that he continues to be, the head of the organization, and the most successful one for sure.
How about Arturo Beltran Leyva?
Now on the business side, I think he's unmatched when it comes to business. He was fair. He was probably what I consider to be, when in terms of economics, probably at that time, he was probably making more money than Chapo and Mayo easily. His organization basically depended on people like me, where he would bring large amounts of drugs into Mexico and other places in the world, and he really didn't traffic drugs into the United States, as people might assume. He left that for individuals like me, his brother, Alfredo at the time, and other big drug traffickers. And that's what I try to explain to people, that the cartel as a whole, it's the cartel is as strong as the people that are in it, right? And there's different entities, which some will be on the business end, some are in the violent side of the end. And for him, you know, he brought in a shipment of 25 tons of cocaine at a time, and you had to make a reservation. And in Mexico, you deal in cash. So he had, he would give good prices. He was a businessman, fair businessman, and it was easy to deal with him. He was a calculator. Like I remember like I would grab my phone to like calculate a number or something, and before I even pressed the number, he was already, telling you what it was. Big numbers. Like he was a one of the best businessmen I feel like there was in that world of drug trafficking.
I always got that impression that when I was reporting on this stuff back in the day. I felt Arturo just seemed this guy Beltran Leyva seems to be the biggest one in terms. He's not as infamous, but he's but then he also has a reputation. I've heard some stories about him being on a personal level quite a scary guy. I mean, you hear the kind of cannibalism, this kind of stuff.
Again, I think
Yeah,
it goes back to this. My personal what I've seen was that it's always about legacy, and you studied. I mean, you worked and you follow the cartels as a whole. To them, legacy, who you are, your name, it's always important. I feel like, from my perspective, from my view of knowing him, that they got caught up and who, the biggest always, right? The question, who was bigger, you know, and he didn't like for the world or for people to think that he wasn't him, that he wasn't, considered the Lord of the Skies, and that there was another, he self-proclaimed boss of bosses.
yeah.
And what he would do to show people who he was the things that you hear about. Violent, no limit when it came to violent. He would, do things to put exclamation points on the way he did things. And I seen that part of him. Again, for the most part, I think that it always goes back to my relationship with these bosses. I didn't want to be them. I have the saying that, in the States, people get money, they get a car, chain, or whatever comes with that life. In Mexico, you you have a little name for yourself, you get a little bit of money. The first thing they want to do is get in a little army. They want to have sicarios and hitmen, and they want to play the role of the big drug lords. And to the drug lords, that's offensive, to the bosses. You want to take my spot, and they're treated the way they behave with violence. My brother and I, on the other hand, we were here for the business, and they treated us like that, and had a great relationship, with him. And I remember one Christmas, he called and said, I got a Christmas gift for you. And he always would give away these, like, expensive vehicles, people don't know. I'm sure you heard about this. He would buy 25, 30 Range Rovers at a time. He would order, 20, 30 pickups to give away as gifts, right? And I'm thinking, wow, he's gonna give me a gift. Like, he was always generous. And he said, I got 1,800 kilos right there. Send for him. I was like, boss, no, I can't. I can't. It's Christmas time. It's like right before the holidays. I said, I don't have, the funds. He said, I'm not asking you for the funds. I'm gonna, lend them to you.
Aren't you 1,800 kilos? Yeah.
And I'm gonna front you the kilos. But in Mexico, like I said, there's no consignment. And I said, sir, I can't take them because, I'm told him in Spanish, le voy a quedar mal. I'm gonna end up, not keeping up when you want to get paid because it wasn't like planned. And he had me on speaker and he said, and that's why I'm calling you. He said, because anyone else would have said, where do I pick them up? You, on the other hand, are saying you don't want to do it because you don't want to, leave a bad taste in my mouth. And that's why I'm calling you. Send for him. You pay me when you're ready.
Now, okay, this is on the Mexico side. On the
And the
US,
Mexican.
on the Chicago side, I mean, you're running this massive distribution hub in Chicago. So all the gangs in Chicago are buying from you. People are coming from all over the East Coast. Did you have to, I mean, how was that trying to run an operation like that? Did you have to end up using violence to keep things running there? Did you how did you manage to like keep everything such a big operation?
To manage, I mean, the operation was, when you go back and look at it, at the scale and the consistency of the operation, we were trafficking anywhere from 2,500 to 3,500 kilos a month, traffic, to over a dozen cities in the US and Canada. Being on the business side, I feel like not only were we able to pick and choose like the right people to deal with, we took losses, but for the most part, I'd rather take that loss than actually, resort to violence. That's how we actually handle our business. We what we did was that we made it so that if anyone thought twice about robbing us or did rob us or try to take advantage of us, like they had nowhere else to go but hopefully retire because they were not going to be able to sell drugs anymore because we are the ones that kind of controlled, the drug trade basically. So it was one of those situations where just because of the business that's the way we ran it, it's like there's nowhere you could actually turn to, right? Without there, you're not gonna be able to take a load of drugs from us or try to compete with us because there's no competition. Basically, I feel like we had a monopoly when it came to the cities we were in, because we always had the best prices and we always had the best quality because we had those relationships. And it took quite a few relationships, as you just heard, about all the people that were kind of in our life some way, somehow to actually keep that going. As far as our time and, at that particular time, in the organization, we were unmatched. There's no one else that could actually, and I say this all the time, to people in the classes that being successful at both ends of, being in the United States and in Mexico is unique because, this might sound, cocky but Chapo or Mayo or Arturo couldn't do what we did in the United States. But yeah, I could do what they did in Mexico. If that makes, any sense.
The American side. That's the side which hasn't really been cut. A lot of journalists in Mexico complain, "Oh, we never hear about how it's working on the American side," and that's the big complaint from journalists down here that hasn't really been told. Although that now we're kind of hearing it with your story and some others. Now, I covered some of your story back in the time in my first book, and maybe I got some things right or wrong there. But my understanding was there was this war happened between Beltran Leyva and Chapo, and that started to kind of put pressure on your side because they were fighting over who you're working for. Is that correct, or how did that when that war exploded in Sinaloa, and I was covering that around the time in Culiacan back in those days? What did that feel like for you when that was happening?
So now here comes for the tricky part.
Yeah,
As I told this recently, I told this to Congress.
yeah,
I feel like if I ever had an issue with anything that was portrayed was on the government side was that they took something that my brother and I did voluntarily and they shaped it into what sounded, whatever they were, wanted to promote was that we were giving ultimatums that we were threatened, by the two most violent drug cartels, the most powerful drug cartels, I want to say, in the world at that time, which we were. Again, me being in that world since I was 7, I try to explain to this, being threatened by drug cartels or members of drug cartels was a part of my everyday life. We were under the gun each and every day. And you covered enough of these stories knowing that you understand where I'm coming from. What always kept my brother and I alive, I think, was instinct. We had already, our family had suffered tremendously by that time. And, my kids were getting older and I didn't want my kids to grow up like the way I grew up. And, it was coming to a point where I could see the line being, drawn in the sand. That's what people like to say that, either I was gonna, it was gonna come to, you know, a point of no return for us, that we're not gonna be able to continue to be who we were as individuals and have that, what we thought was moral compass, right? Of not crossing the line, that it was gonna get to a point where it was gonna, we were not gonna have a choice. And that didn't sit well with us. Uh, I felt like, my kids were, getting older and I was seeing my kids being around certain environments that I didn't feel comfortable with. And it was only going to continue, escalate, especially with, what I seen was coming. And I think that for the most part, my brother and I, and it's hard, it's cognitive dissonance that, we thought we were good people, to us, it was a business. And it took, marrying my wife, who, and my brother's wife are both daughters of law enforcement, who, it's hard where it's like they'd be like, no, that, like it doesn't matter. You're still not doing the right thing. And them wanting more for us for sure had an impact. And I had one of those moments where I would be like, okay, well, I think every drug trafficker gets to a point where it's like, I wish there's a way. And I remember I would pray on that all the time. And, I say this that I would be like, how? There's no way. And, you know, I feel like I had a spiritual epiphany one day where I woke up with this idea of saying I could cooperate. It wasn't easy thing to do. I felt like it was going to be the only way I could like rid myself of even family members, right? This was all the life we all knew, and I wanted to do something good for my family. And my brother and I, we talked it out, and it was a risk that we were taking, a gamble. You covered those stories back then. There was a war, coming, and we were gonna risk our life to cooperate against these powerful trafficking organization cartels, right? In the likes of Mayo Zambada and Chapo Guzman, Arturo Beltran Leyva, and risk our life to try just for the benefit of hopefully getting some credit, for our cooperation. And I think that gets overlooked. I mean, everyone who's, intelligent enough will say, well, you cooperated from March of 2008 to, November 30th, 2008 against drug cartels
Yeah.
while I was in Mexico.
Wow.
While
In Mexico,
Wow.
vaping. Yeah, yeah. So
Well, then the war started, officially probably by April. And, those threats came, once the war started, and probably progressed. But I was already cooperating. The government for sure knew that we were threatened, but we were working undercover. And I think that the fact that I risked my life to do the right thing gets overlooked. And that's the only thing I won't ever give up. That thank God my brother and I survived. And if it was for a selfish reason, if it was for whatever reason, I know I'm never going to be able to undo those wrongs, but we did it. That's the difference.
you did time in federal prison. Was it in federal prison you did time? And was it like what was it like doing time? That was after you'd cooperated, and so you were still were you in danger there? Did you have to be like segregated?
Mhm. So, I turned myself at the end of November 2008. It took several years for me to actually get my prison sentence. I got sentenced in January of 2015 to 14 years in prison, which I had to serve exactly 12 years for. I spent in those 12 years, I spent almost 3 years segregated, which is probably the most horrible thing you had to go through as a human being. I think of, especially for me, who I have a twin brother who, you're separated, you're put, alone in a 24-hour a day lockdown, some similar to what Chap was going through today. Yeah, prison, it was a long time. I had plenty of time to think about what was going to be the next chapter in my life. There's plenty of times where, wish that I felt like I was always a little bit more intelligent, but I felt like the stupidest thing was that I entered the drug trade. Um, and I spent 12 years, my brother and I, and basically we're placed in a WITSEC for prisons, which is still prison, just a little bit more. They add different security measures to keep you, kind of safe, as possible.
So how now you're 42 years old, and you're kind of rebuilding a life outside of this world. I mean, how does that feel like? Um, what's it like trying to do that? How do you feel, right now inside trying to do this, talking to police, talking to the people who used to go after you? What's it like trying to do that? And what do you see now in the world about where this is going with this trafficking and stuff?
So, for the most part, having that time in prison, like my family has suffered a lot, somewhat through our own choices, that we have to be responsible for. And I feel like I have this like feeling or this need to do something with, all my knowledge and all my expertise. I feel like there's something missing, and I believe in second chances and redemption. I'm a Christian. I believe that I was forgiven for my sins, and now what do I do with that? And the Bible always says like you share your suffering, you share your testimony, and I shared it already in a way, right, in courts, but I think this time it was a little bit different. It's like, to me, it's means to me for my children, for what's left of my legacy, because I'm always talking about how these drug traffickers are always chasing legacy. I think I kind of took that, and I'm like, you know what? I want to make sure that by the time I leave here, that my legacy is something positive, that I was able to, leave a good impression for my children and for all those people who have suffered from drug trafficking, that there is a way where we can actually make a difference and make some change for good.
Okay, so you've got to the end of this podcast, and if you got to the end, then you're seriously interested in this subject. So come along and check out www.crashoutmedia.com. Get yourself a free subscription. Check out stories, analysis, interviews about the narco war and how to try to find a way out of this. And if you like it and want to support it, take out $5 a month to make all this happen and get bigger and better. And check out the other podcasts I have right here in the Narco Chronicles series. Stay well, stay safe, and see you next time.